Well, hello again everybody, and welcome back to what I promise will be the last episode of this little MASTERADIO series. Well, you can see while you've been away, I've actually gone ahead and I've restrung the radio. I've reattached the tuning drum, barrel, whatever you want to call it. That fell off previously. So I've gone ahead and I've reattached that, and I've got to admit there was only a rather minimum amount of wailing and gnashing of teeth, which is always associated with restringing a radio, but that seems to be moving okay now. Haven't done anything with this frequency changer valve socket. I've actually ordered some new valve sockets and they have arrived. In fact, here's one of the valve sockets. Let's see what these look like, because I've not actually opened this packet up yet. In theory these are brand new old stock. It's amazing you can still get these things, isn't it? I wonder how old this is. Maybe from the 1940s or 30s. Who knows what's lurking in here to jump out at me. How many is there in here? Just one. Just one. And it's all packed in that lovely greased paper. I wonder if these are like ex-military or something like that. Well, it does say this was repacked. Repacked primary standard April 1966. So apparently this was repacked in 1966. So God knows how old it actually is. Just seem ashamed to unwrap this, but yeah, we may as well. And it's complete in what looks like some waxy paper. So let's do a bit of a reveal on this. Oh, it's almost vacuum sealed. It's very tight in there. Okay, we'll have to cut the other bit open, I think. So I'm wondering if these are like wartime stock or something like that. This paper's probably impregnated in something that's amazingly toxic, and my fingers will probably all fall off at some point later this evening. Well, can't exactly see how it's taped together. I think we're just going to have to cut it. Oh, and we actually do get two valve bases. Okay, so I wonder if they're the same size as the one that's in there. Shall we just find a valve, make sure it actually fits the valve? Yeah, they do fit there. Oh wow, that is super tight though. That's from one extreme to the other. I'm sure they will fit. This is the bad rectifier valve that we had before. And yeah, again, they're all waxy. They're probably covered in lanolin or something like that, so these probably want a good clean before we install them. So I've got to admit, I haven't decided whether or not I am going to try to replace that valve base yet. It does look very, very similar to the original one. In fact, I think it may be exactly the same, so it would be a drop-in replacement. But unfortunately, this being the frequency changer valve, actually pretty much every one of the pins here is soldered down, and probably have to disturb all the wiring around this intermediate frequency transformer here to actually get at it. So I'm actually thinking that I might actually do a little bit of a billy bodge, yeah, because I am a bodger, aren't I? You all know that I like to bodge things. Quite often what they would have done back in the day, they wouldn't necessarily have changed out the valve sockets. The first thing they would have done is what I tried to do. They would have just tried to squeeze the pins a little bit tighter together, so that's the first thing you try. But the other thing you can do to actually bodge these things, if you get a piece of very fine wire, something like that, what you can actually do, if you've got one defective socket, you can actually solder a piece of wire onto the valve pin. You thread that piece of fine wire up through the valve socket, wrap it round and put a blob of solder on it, and that will actually just solder the valve effectively into place with a little piece of link wire. Of course, that's no good if you've actually got to change the valve out at some point. And I think I did say earlier, they're incredibly loose, this valve. Just looking at it now, it almost drops out. Yeah, God, it's just so loose. So obviously that's it's quite a big job to change that valve socket, so it wouldn't be surprising that back in the day they actually did used to just bodge these things, and maybe that's what I will do as well, because you know, there reaches a point where, well, I reach a point where I've had enough. In fact, looking at all these pins, I think they are all broken. I'm just touching them and another one's just fallen off, so I think these are fatigued, or these have been damaged over time. So yeah, I think sadly maybe I'm going to have to eat my words and we're going to have to tackle that valve socket. I don't know, we'll see how we feel later when we've got the radio up and running, because yeah, it's in a pretty bad way, that socket. I think one of the reasons that I was just a little inclined to try to do some bodgery on it is because the socket is also riveted in, and I think it'll be a little bit of a pain to get at. I think that's the main thing. I'm worried about disturbing all the wiring around it, and yeah, you quite often start these jobs and you know, one thing leads to another, and then you end up rewiring half the radio. I don't know, let's see how we get on when we got power on the radio. Well, I'm sure that you also remember that I had a little bit of a disaster with these capacitors which we put in place, where I tried to extract our HT supply from the centre tap of this this bank of capacitors. Now unfortunately what happened is when I connected the rectifier to it, it kind of did pull off the positive voltage, but what it left behind was a minus voltage, which actually just turned our rectifier off. So although I was thinking I was being quite clever, yeah, it was like Wile E. Coyote and back to his chalkboard, so that was a massive fail. So let's disconnect that. Hopefully my soldering iron is hot now. Okay, get rid of that. Get rid of that, and we'll keep these capacitors for future use. So these particular capacitors, what were they? I think they were about, oh, got it on 4 microfarad. These were 4 microfarad each. But I think in my calculations last week, I actually said we needed something around, I think it was something around 2.3 microfarads. Now what's this one? Well, according to this one says it's 2.5 microfarads. So I did order 2 or 3 of these capacitors. I think I ordered a 2.5, and because I knew we needed a little bit more current, I also ordered a 3 microfarad one. But unfortunately this arrived and the 3 microfarad one didn't. But what I did find in my inbox from RS, there was just a notice saying, for whatever reason, the 3 microfarad capacitor that I actually ordered had been withdrawn, and would I like to order a different one? So that was a little bit annoying because I didn't find the email, and because of the corona thing, I'd left the whole package from RS in quarantine for a few days, so I didn't know it was missing. But I think I'm bored with spending money and spending time on this radio now, so I think it is going to go ahead with this 2.5 microfarad on it, and I think it should work just about, so we're going to use that. Maybe we'll reduce the level of the dropping resistor a little bit, just to bring up the HT voltage. Now we had a little happy accident. Remember there was an old capacitor installed in this radio, and it just so happens that the clip that fitted the old electrolytic capacitor, it just fit this one quite smoothly, quite smugly. Is that a word? Smugly. Quite, yeah, brain fart. Quite. How does it fit it? Snugly, that's the word I was looking for. It fits it quite snugly. So we might actually go and try to install this capacitor kind of in the original position of the main smoothing capacitor. So I'm not going to do that yet. Let me just wire this into circuit. We'll run the radio up again, and let's give it a blast and see if it works. Well, you know, I'm always a little bit embarrassed when you come round, because my bench is always a mess. I'm always untidy, aren't I? And I'd love to present you with a lovely, clean, tidy bench, and there's just stuff everywhere. It makes it hard for you to actually see what I'm doing, but yeah, I'm afraid I am just quite an untidy person, and yeah, not a lot I can do about that. I am just very untidy. Now in theory, because we are pulling the HT off the top of the heater chain, we should actually be a little bit low on B plus voltage on HT, but I'm hoping the fact that we're using a solid state rectifier diode, I'm just hoping that that's going to maybe save us another 20 or 30 volts, and that should be enough just to keep this actually running. I'm not sure if that's the case, but again, just another little experiment. Okay, because I'm feeling especially safety conscious here, let's just put a bit of crap old masking tape over these wires. It'll be fine, nothing could go wrong surely. Yeah, that'll be good. Yeah, good. So let's use this one to measure our DC volts. And I think the radio chassis itself is actually close enough to the neutral line to make not a lot of difference, so we'll clip onto there. And I think we'll just use this as a bit of a wander lead. Okay, so that's really even tidier now, isn't it? It's test leads spaghetti, I'm afraid. As I said earlier, what could possibly go wrong? That will be fine. And the other thing that I want in circuit is this little clamp meter. These are very handy. So I did all that maths last week, and as you saw, I made a total cock up of it, didn't I? But there we go. What I would say is probably what you want to do is you want to just go out and buy some capacitors in various values, probably between about 2 microfarad and maybe about 4 microfarads. And one of those will actually probably do quite well for your capacitive dropper, depending on slight variations between one radio and another. At the end of the day, even if you do all the maths and calculate it right, there's going to be a bit of trial and error involved. It's just the way it is. So if I was going to do this again, I probably wouldn't do all the maths again. What I would do is I'd go to the junk box, I'd get a 2.5 microfarad capacitor out, I'll get a clamp meter, or just put your AVO in circuit with the current from the heater, and I would wind it up, because everybody repairs valve radios. You should all have a variac and an isolation transformer, you really should. So what I would do is I would wind up the voltage on a variac to the main supply, 230 volts. I would keep an eye on the clamp meter, and then I would just tune the components to get you know, roughly the right current going through the heater chain and the right voltage across them. So if I was going to do it again, that is absolutely the way I would do it. I probably wouldn't bother with all the maths that I did this time, but it was an interesting learning experience, and you know, that's a part of the point of why I do these radios. It isn't because I need another valve radio at the end of it, it's because I enjoy experimenting, and we enjoy learning about things, or certainly I do. So the incoming supply is about 230 volts. I can see the dial is actually, dial lamp is oh, we've got some noise. Is it going to tune? Oh, we're getting some DX action there. Yeah, oh, it's just not looking too good. My HT voltage here, it's only at 50 volts DC. I was actually hoping for quite a bit more than that. Now I'm going to turn the voltage up a little bit more. We're on 230 volts here, 232 volts, but I think I've said to you before, my electricity supply at my particular house, it's anywhere between 240 volts and 250 on a daily basis. So I'm going to turn this up a little bit higher. Oh, maybe not that high though. But we're getting Radio Beijing there as well. Some kind of bizarre Euro pop there.
This is a lovely message we've got in tonight. I believe Chris scored a hat-trick, but it included an own goal, so perhaps he was the first Premier League player to score for both.
Well, I think it is amazing. This radio seemed to work down to about 20 volts of HT before, but I really wanted to see something closer to 120, so unfortunately that's annoying, isn't it? We haven't got quite as much HT as I wanted. Also, my valve current here is it's only 139 milliamps at the moment, which is being fed to our valves, and I wanted something a bit closer to 150. So I actually think that I do need to go ahead and maybe, rather than having a 2.5 microfarad capacitor, we want to go something a little bit closer to 3 microfarads. I'm just wondering if I can go and find a capacitor in my junk drawer and pull it up a little bit because it's getting quite expensive in buying the wrong capacitor doing this. So I've gone ahead and I found another 0.5 of a microfarad. Again, this capacitor is rated at around 400, is that 440 volts? Or is it around 400? 440 volts. So let's just put this in my little box of death here. Clip that onto there. Clip leads, perfect for mains voltages. Clip leads, aren't they? Sure, they're what could go wrong? Let's have another go. We should have auto power off. It is damnation. Okay, so I've got 242 volts on the radio. That's brought our HT up from, what was it before? Was it around 60? So effectively it's only brought it up another 10 volts. I'm sure we had more HT than that last week. Well, I've been messing around with the radio for about another half an hour, and I tried tweaking the capacitor values and also the anti-surge resistor to try to increase the supply to the rectifier. And I've got to admit, I didn't really have a great success for that. So our HT supply now is around 80 volts, whereas in theory it should be much nearer to 120. But I have to say, even at 80 volts, it doesn't seem to have affected the operation of the radio at all. It seems to be working quite well. Now, I did think about getting a bigger capacitor here. I was going to get a bigger value of capacitance, which would have actually increased the current flowing to the heater supply, which I would have then had to have dropped using another series resistor, but that would have actually upped the HT a little bit more. But in the end, I've just decided not to bother. I did explore it, but it turns out that it's kind of a balancing act between the anti-surge resistor and the capacitance value, and unfortunately the requirements are kind of in opposite directions. So I also didn't want to spend any more money, to be quite honest. I think this has gone on quite long enough, and I didn't really want to place another order with RS and having to wait a day or two for stuff to arrive. So I've gone ahead and I've used what we've got. So we've actually got, rather than having, I think I said originally it was going to be a 69 ohm resistor, this has increased to about 100, which means that in theory the valve filaments take a little bit less current now, and also the startup current has been reduced a little bit at switch on. So that's probably a good thing, and because this resistance value is increased, it also means that the HT will have gone up very slightly as well. But the main reason I'm using this is because of what I've got, you know. Now, before I had one of those large ceramic square resistors. They're a bit difficult to mount, so I've actually used one of these. I think they call them Arcol resistors, one of these Arcol wire round resistors. Now, the main reason I've used it isn't for the power handling, it's just because they come with holes in them, so it makes them easy to bolt down to the chassis. And I think this is going to get just slightly, and I mean that honestly, it will just get slightly warm. It's certainly not going to get very hot. So what I think we'll do is, I'm going to put a little bit of heatsink compound under here, you know, after all, why not? I'm going to bolt this down and we're going to have a go at wiring it up, and yeah, we'll see how we go. It's not been a bad day today, but I don't know if you can hear on the camera, a bit of a storm seems to have just swept in now, and the rain is absolutely lashing against my windows at the moment. It's, yeah, all the windows are shaking, it's quite windy out there. Of course, before installing this resistor and putting the heatsink compound, I've just gone ahead and I've changed into my best trousers, because yeah, that's what you need to do before putting heatsink compound, because yeah, it goes everywhere. Well, it does when I do it anyway. Okay, that's got a little bit of compound on there. People have a habit of putting far too much heatsink compound on. If you put too much on, it doesn't really help you. In fact, what it actually does, it makes the components stand off, and you get a worse thermal transfer, so you don't need a huge amount of heatsink compound. Well, it had two ways to go on, cross-threaded or not, and of course it chose to go on cross-threaded. Okay, so we've gone ahead and hopefully we've bolted this resistor down securely. Now, as you can probably also see, I did actually manage to use the old bracket that was actually fixing down the main electrolytic smoothing capacitor. So I've reutilised that to hold our mains dropper capacitor. So that works quite well. So I think from the top side of the chassis, you really shouldn't be able to see much evidence of anything being done. So here's the cable that's coming from the capacitor, and I'm really hoping that this isn't going to introduce too much mains hum into the set. But I guess again, don't quite know. We'll just have to see, won't we? Well, I'm just going to head and I've just put a little bit of thermal insulation where it runs past this power resistor. I don't think this is going to get even any more than just slightly warm. We've wired up our diode, we've got our capacitor in circuit. So this is actually modern cable, but it's just got a cloth covering on it, so it is insulated. I don't think the insulation is probably as good on it as it would be a proper PVC mains flex or something of that nature, but again, I do quite like the look of it, and I think it will go well with this radio. Now the old mains cable did just stuff through this grommet here, so I propose to do much the same, I think. And I think what we'll do for our strain relief is, well, I think we'll tie a knot in it, and I think that will call it done. Top quality workmanship here, isn't there? I think the original radio did have some kind of a strain relief over here, and unfortunately I think what happened is when I undid it, it was just made out of plastic and it just crumbled apart. So what I think I might do is I'm just going to put a little section of heat shrink over there, this section of cable I think, and then what I'll do is, again, not today but off camera, I'll go ahead and I'll fabricate some kind of little P-clip to hold this wire down, but we'll just put a little bit of heat shrink around it just again to stop the P-clip digging into the wire, so let me do that. Oh, that's interesting. It's got a layer of blue on it, but inside there is kind of quite a tough material, so it's almost as though, I guess maybe this is how they get around the law of it being a double insulated cable. So this blue sheath is an outer sheath, and then there's some tougher material inside it. That's quite clever, isn't it? So this cable is kind of double insulated. Annoyingly though, I can't strip the bugger. Okay, they worked. It's quite nicely made cable, that. Okay, well I've gone ahead and I've just put a little bit of heat shrink around the other end of the wire, because this end is going to go on the cord grip of the plug, so that's what I've done there. So I've just picked up the glass for the frequency dial, and you can actually see that it's got maybe some of the station numbers written onto it. Now unfortunately you can't really clean these. As soon as you touch any of this lettering which is printed onto the back side of it, it will just rub off. Just the slightest touch makes it come off. It's very unstable. I did have a go at cleaning this top side here, and I was actually quite surprised to find out this is a piece of plastic. I actually thought that this was a piece of glass, but no, it's not glass. It's I don't know what it would be. Did they use celluloid plastic or something? I don't know what the plastic they had back in the day, but yeah, it's a piece of plastic. So we've got to go ahead, install this, and put it back into its case, and we're nearly done there, I think. So it is quite nice to know, even though the HT supply on this radio is actually a little bit low, it really doesn't seem to have had any effect on the sensitivity of this radio or the volume. It's actually bringing stations in very well. Like I say, the only problem we have got is I have to keep wiggling the mixer frequency changer valve, because it's just making such bad contacts. I was planning on just trying to bodge it by wrapping some kind of binding wire around the terminals, but I'm afraid there's just so many wires on them I can't even do that. It was tempting to just solder the pins on, but I have managed to stop myself from doing that. Okay, let's see if we can just get some power on it, give it a quick run before we put it back into its case. The dial lamp is glowing very, very feebly. Totally useless, in fact. You're not even going to see that when it's on. Hopefully this radio will spring into life any moment now. Come on.
And it's unequivocal. It thinks that there is a bias about how we describe players, particularly in criticising them, depending on their skin tone.
It is relentless attacking from City is. Zinchenko swinging across in deep. McCarthy gets a hand.
Okay, so we seem to be picking up some DX stations there. think it's quite impressive for such a small radio. What do you think? What do we think that is? Voice of Romania or something like that? Not sure.
And part of this was all building of a picture to try.
I think that's long wave.
Argument going, but ultimately.
Így azokon tud firma doar nebunii iubesc.
Maviller bir atak şansı yakalamak istiyor. Orta çizgi üzerinde Hüseyin. Hüseyin sağ tarafa doğru döndü. Topla buluşan Sosa. Sosa savunma arkasına. Ekuba'nın koşu yoluna. Ekuba şu faali.
Montrait également les images des remèdes et des outils auxquels on a eu recours pour lutter contre le virus. Sans oublier qu'ils ont encore représenté des...
Well, I think we're getting to about the point where we're going to call it done. Now you can see I've gone ahead and just temporarily I've put a cable tie around our mains cord, and that's got it fairly well, so let me just snip that off. I'm hoping that it's going to go back into the case just with this cable tie overlapping the side. At some point in the future I will fashion a proper P-clip, but I think that again that's good enough for now. As I said earlier, a lot of these valve holders, I'm actually amazed at how bad they are. I've never seen valve holders which are so loose. If I was to tip this radio upside down, you would actually find that about half of the valves would just drop out. So I'm not sure if the valve holders have failed because of people wiggling the pins backwards and forwards to try and get a good connection, or maybe it's just because of the heat build up in the cabinet with everything expanding and contracting. But unfortunately the valve holder contacts, they haven't responded to closing them up. I tried squeezing one or two of them shut, but as soon as you touch them, literally for some reason the metal is very fatigued and they just fall apart. But what I did find is kind of a temporary little fix. I found that if I actually just put some sideways pressure onto the valves, that they do seem to make contact. So I think until I get around to changing these valve holders out, that's what I've done. So you can see these have got a piece of cable wrapped round them, and well, it doesn't seem to get so hot that it melts the cable, so that's okay. I did find that this valve here, this frequency changer valve, was getting a little bit hotter. So this one's, again, I've got a strap of wire around it, just pulling the valve sideways to put some sideways contact onto the valve holder pins. But I've actually put a little bit of heat resistant covering around this metal wire plastic covered strap. Again, these valves don't actually seem to get too hot in operation. Maybe it'll get a little bit hotter when it's back in its case, but I think really that's what I'm going to do now. I think I'm going to put this radio back into its case, and then I'm just going to leg it basically. Just noticed my isolation transformer was still plugged in. It was turned off, but I always think when you're working on mains equipment, it's very good practice to get in the habit of unplugging things. You're far less likely to make a mistake if you actually unplug the radio. Right, so now I need to go and get the radio case, which I have cleaned up, and I don't think I've shown you that yet. So let me go and find the case for the radio, and you can have a look at that and see what you think. Actually looks a little bit different now, because what I've gone ahead and done is I've taken some of these, they're kind of like wax crayon close-up, so maybe you can just see it looks as though it's got little pimples or spots. Well, every one of these was a woodworm just to stabilise the varnish, which is flaking off, just to stop it flaking off anymore. I did think of... Okay, so here you can see we've got the radio cabinet, and I'm sure you'll agree it doesn't actually look too bad, does it? It has come out quite nicely, but unfortunately this isn't the result that I was looking for. Now, the main reason that I actually bought this radio is because it was in such appalling condition. It was, I'm sure you'll remember from part one, it was absolutely awful. It was totally falling apart. It was actually covered in woodworm holes. It was all eaten away. There was hundreds and hundreds of little holes here, which I painstakingly filled with wax. Now, originally I did want to keep these woodworm holes, but I've got to admit I did decide in the end that if I didn't fill them with something, if ever another hole appeared, I would wonder whether or not it was still active with woodworm. So even though I gave you all my good advice and told you all that heating it up to 50 or 60 degrees for a few hours would kill the woodworm, I didn't actually have quite enough confidence to follow my own advice, did I? I haven't done. I've actually filled all these little woodworm flight holes where the adult beetles emerge. We've covered them in wax, and this radio has had a coat of shellac over it. Unfortunately, again, the condition of the radio before was really bad, with really heavy staining on it in various areas, and unfortunately when I actually cleaned some of the finish off and I just rubbed it down with wire wool, we lost a lot of that patina effect. So I have actually gone ahead and I've applied some stain to it, and again, I've not got the effect I wanted, because what I actually did do, and you can't really see it because it hasn't come out as I intended, what I did is I actually did put a lot of very dark stain in certain areas, you know, to try to replicate the old radio cabinet. It had like dark patches along here, and it was very dark, you know, certain areas, you know, just that patina look. So what I did was, when I re-stained it, what I did is I actually took some wire wool and I did actually rub most of the stain off it and tried to achieve that same aged effect. I mean, maybe you can just about see it there, how it's darker up in this corner, but I don't exactly understand it, although it looked quite good as it was. As I say, I did manage to stain it and I put some wear marks into it as though it had been bleached by the sun. But when I went ahead and put an overcoat of shellac onto it, I think maybe it lifted the stain out of the wood grain and it's made it look quite even again. Obviously I need a little bit more practice at it. I particularly wanted it to look kind of more grubby and dirty around the underside of the grill here. So one thing that I haven't done is, normally when I apply shellac I would let it go off, and then, you know, a few days later I'd probably go over this with some very fine wire wool and some wax. Well, I purposely haven't waxed it because I may actually try to go in with some, I don't know, some dark ink or something like that on top of the shellac to try and dirty this area up and try to put that patina back. I've got to admit I'm not totally happy with the result, but overall I think this radio does look quite good now, you know, but that wasn't the look I was going for. I was looking for it to look very distressed, so fortunately I failed in that. Anyway, let's see if this radio will go back into its box. I think it should do with a bit of luck. I think it's going in. There we go. And like me, you're seeing this for the first time. I haven't tried it back in its woodwork yet. So, what do you think of that? Can you see that? Doesn't look too bad, does it? Now, to actually fix this radio into its chassis, it does have some screws that have to go in, and again, we probably need to do a little bit more work on these screws at some point in the future. The reason being, of course, is that any screw that contacts the live chassis, it will be exposed. So if somebody was to pick up the radio while it was plugged in, these screws that touch the chassis, they would be live. Now also, if this radio loses a knob off these control shafts, again it potentially exposes the operator to some potentially quite dangerous voltages. So normally what you would do is when you would install these control knobs, what you would do is you would fill the grub screw hole, you fill that with wax, you tighten them up and then you fill it with wax. So again, if I was not to do any work in the future, that's what I would do now. I would fit the knob on, we'd fill it with some hard brown wax and we'd call it done. But I'm not going to do that because I think we are going to see this radio again in more detail when I actually have a go at replacing those valve holders in. Now the other thing that I didn't show you, I've actually gone ahead and I've also done a very rough alignment on it, and we did get a little bit of advantage from doing the alignment, but it certainly wasn't perfect. I found out that one of the, it's actually this transformer here, one of the cores, and there's two cores in here, there's the top core and the bottom core. The bottom core is very, very loose. It seemed to be flopping around as I was adjusting it, so we managed to get an improvement in the IF response, and then I could kind of feel it as I took the alignment tool off, the IF response shifted, and when I just touched the tool back to it, it improved again. So it was kind of that juggling act of trying to align the core, but I suspect if you tap the side of the radio, this core would be wobbling around inside. So again, we need to do something at some point in the future to improve that. So I think what I'll do off camera, I will actually 3D print some little kind of covers that will clip over each of these screws, but just for now I think I will just put a little bit of tape over them. I did say earlier, didn't I, that I think as people who repair radios, we have got somewhat of a responsibility. We're not just doing these repairs for ourselves because, you know, it doesn't matter if I get an electric shock or get hurt. You've got to kind of think down to the lowest common denominator that, you know, you might have a young child, somebody else visiting your house, you can't watch people all the time, somebody might see this radio playing and, you know, want to admire it closely, pick it up to take a closer look, and they could get a nasty shock. Now that really shouldn't happen because the chassis should be connected to the neutral side of the mains supply. But again, you never know, it could be plugged in on an extension lead, the extension lead could be wired wrongly, and again, it's not unknown for people to have plug sockets which are incorrectly wired. So this isn't really an acceptable repair and it isn't going to be permanent. These buttons don't actually have a mark on, do they, for on and off? I don't think they do. Let me just double check. That one does. It has the wave change settings on it. That doesn't have a mark. That doesn't have a mark, so it doesn't matter in fact how these go on. Now the other thing that I would say you should do is, you can see, I don't know if you can see, these shafts do just have some marks on where the grub screw has actually been biting in. I don't think that's adequate for an AC/DC set. Again, what I would normally do is I would take this knob off and I would look where the, well, I would look here where the shaft has been, where the grub screw has been biting into the shaft, and then what I will do is I'll take a little Dremel or something like that and I will partially drill a hole into the shaft so that the grub screw sits into it. What that will do is if the actual screw comes loose, the knob will be wobbly, but the knob won't actually pull off in your hand. If you touch the knob and find it wobbles, you'll know it's loose, whereas you don't have that indent into the shaft. You will touch the knob and it'll just come off in your hand, and then potentially you'll be left with a live shaft, which is bad. Now there doesn't appear to be any obvious kind of strain relief for this antenna cord. It could be that originally it was clipped in some way, but certainly there isn't a clip remaining now. So I've just taken a plastic washer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put this inside with a little bit of slack to spare like that, so if this gets pulled now it can't go far, it's not going to rip the wire off the radio. I don't think I've given that a clean with anything yet. I must give that a wipe down. So I'm hoping I can just go ahead and maybe just try cleaning the back of this with just a little bit of this wax. I'm not going to go mad with it. Let's just see if that cleans up a bit. Yeah, I think it does actually. Now I wasn't actually going to put any wax on the top cover because I said I might go in and actually ink some of this in, but having said all that, we both know that the reality is this radio is going to cardboard box for the next 10 years and probably get forgotten about, so if it doesn't get a bit of wax on it now, it's probably never going to. So yeah, let's see if we can just put a little bit of wax on the cabinet. The surface finish on this radio, it's not super smooth. And again, I did say that wasn't the look I was going for. I wasn't going for super smooth. Well, the other thing that I had to do, I had to glue quite a lot of the veneer down on it because it was hanging off. So all the veneer on the corners, it has been re-glued, and I had to do that just to re-stabilise it, because if I'd have caught it with a rag like this, it would have just ripped all the veneer off. So it's had a little bit done to it. Now the other thing I was thinking of doing with this radio is, I was actually also thinking of using a product called antique wax, it's got quite a lot of like dark brown and black pigment in it, and that will also kind of stain the surface a little bit. So that's an option, to try and touch in some of the distressing on the corners and stuff, to use an antique wax. So the problem is I've used that sometimes in the past and it kind of stands out very obviously. It sits on top and it looks a bit of a mess. I don't know, I'm not sure about that, whether or not to use an antique wax or not. Maybe again you can leave it in the comments. Do you think we should try with an antique wax? I'm really not sure. What I tend to do is just put it on fairly generously like this and then leave it for half an hour to kind of harden up, and then you just buff it off with a soft cloth. Now these knobs haven't got any kind of wax on, and I did actually clean them with some degreaser, so again hopefully when these take a bit of wax, these should actually shine up nicely, the Bakelite material on them. Right, well I think that will do for now, and what I'm going to do is we'll leave this for half an hour because the wax has to kind of go off a little bit. It's going to go hard because if you just rub it now, you'll actually wipe all the wax off, and you want to leave a little bit on. So we'll leave this wax to go hard. Probably takes about 20 minutes, half an hour for the solvent to partially flash off, and then we'll give it a little bit of a polish, and then I'm going to call this radio done.